Hello, First Presbyterian. Welcome to chapter 5, working our way through Lent. And today's chapter is about the Last Supper that Jesus has with his disciples. And so again, if you're just joining us, we're working on this book right here by Amy Jill Levine, and we're looking at chapter 5, which is called The Last Supper, Risking the Loss of Friends. So I want to start off our session today by having you do a little bit of work on your own. So you're going to pause the video and talk about look up some biblical passages and write down some of your thoughts and reflections, or talk to the person you're with if you're watching this video with someone. And then when you're done, unpause the video and we'll keep going. So the passages I'm going to have you look at are, so you might want to write this down, Exodus chapter 12 and John 1:29 through 34. So Exodus 12, John 1:29 through 34. And I'm going to give you some questions to think about for each one. So when you look at Exodus 12 and read it over, here are 3 questions I want you to think about. So write these down. The first question is, what is the Passover lamb and what are the Israelites supposed to do with it? Second question, what is God trying to accomplish for his people? Third question, what is God trying to teach to his people? So read Exodus chapter 12 and reflect on or talk about those 3 questions. Then go to John 1:29 through 34, and I've got 3 more questions for you. So write these down as well. What are the different things that John calls Jesus? What titles does John give to Jesus? Second, given what you've just read in the book of Exodus, what do you think these titles mean? Or to put it another way, what would a Jew of Jesus's time think that they meant? That's your second question. Third question, what is John trying to say about Jesus? So pause the video and go read Exodus chapter 12 and think about those questions, and then read John chapter 1:29 through 34 and read those questions. Then when you're done, unpause the video and we'll keep going. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to look at Exodus 12 and John chapter 1 and have written down or talked about some of your thoughts. So I'm just going to share some of my thoughts, and that will be it for this week. So the disciples in the Last Supper are eating and preparing for the Passover meal with Jesus. So this is what they're all thinking about, the Passover. And it's not an accident that Jesus' death and resurrection occurs over Passover, over the celebration of the Passover. Because as you all know, the Passover is that time when God freed his people from the slavery of Egypt with the last and the 10th plague against the Egyptians. And so it's the final plague in which the Egyptians finally say, okay, we give up, we surrender, yes, we won't, we want you to leave, you're free to go. So Passover emphasizes several different things, and this is just a really brief overview. Of course, the Passover is so rich and so full of meaning that it's worth studying for a lot of time all on its own. But a few things that the Passover emphasizes for the Jews. First of all, the Passover emphasizes God's promise to free his people from their enemies. The Passover reminds the people of Israel that God is faithful. He keeps his promises. If he kept his promise back then, he will keep whatever promises he has made to us today. Second, the Passover emphasizes that God has the power to keep his promises, that he can do whatever is necessary to make those promises come true. Sometimes we make promises that we really, really want to keep. We unfortunately, due to time or circumstances or limitations, can't keep our promises. God can always keep his promises. He has the power to keep his promises. Third, Passover emphasizes that a sacrifice of blood is necessary to accomplish God's will, which is to free his people from their enemies and to reconcile them with himself. And this isn't always easy to understand. And again, this could take a lot of we could use a lot of time to explore this and think about this idea. But certainly the Passover emphasizes that a sacrifice of blood is what God uses to accomplish his will, to free his people and to be reconciled to them. Next, the Passover emphasizes that we cannot provide that sacrifice for ourselves. God provides the sacrifice. God provides the reconciliation. Our job is to trust him and obey him. So God lays out this plan for the Israelites: get these lambs, sacrifice them, put their blood over the door, eat them in this way, be ready. Their job isn't to figure out how this is going to work or why it's going to work. Their job isn't to make sure that it works. Their job is just to follow the instructions, to say, I trust God enough to obey him. This is pretty weird, and I have no idea what's going to happen tonight, but I'm going to do what God has told me to do and trust that something good will come from that he is working for my benefit and on my behalf. So the Passover emphasizes the need of us, God's people, to put our trust in him and to obey him and to believe that whatever he's doing, no matter how strange it might seem to us, that it will result in him keeping his promises to us. So the disciples are going to be thinking about those things as they prepare for the Passover meal and while they're eating it with Jesus. Now, let's think about what John calls Jesus in John chapter 1. John calls Jesus the Lamb of God and the chosen one. John wants us to associate Jesus with the Lamb of God, the one whose blood protects God's people from the Egyptians. The lamb's blood doesn't so much protect God's people from the Egyptians, at least not directly. Rather, it protects them from death itself. And I think this is a really interesting distinction to think about, that the blood of the lamb protects them from the angel of death. And so the blood of the lamb protects the Israelites from a much more serious enemy than the Egyptians. And I'm not trying to downplay the Egyptians at all. They are a very serious enemy for Israel and a serious oppressor. And yet the blood of the lamb protects them from something even greater, death itself. And the blood of the lamb, because the Egyptians do not make use of the blood of the lamb, they are not protected from death. And so John wants us to associate Jesus with the Passover lamb, whose blood protects us from death itself, not from a temporary or temporal enemy, as terrible as those can be for sure, but rather from death itself. And death itself, of course, is always the weapon or the threat that any temporal enemy wields over us. So the Egyptians threatened to, for example, kill the baby boys of the Israelites. Rome threatens to kill anyone who steps out of line. So John says this Passover lamb, he's not going for these temporal enemies. He's going for the big enemy itself, death itself. So again, we're alerted to the fact by John calling Jesus the Passover lamb that Jesus is here to save us from our ultimate enemy as opposed to our temporary ones. So he's here to save us from death and sin. Second, John calls Jesus God's chosen one. So here, John is really trying to tell us that Jesus is the one chosen by God to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. Jesus is both the sacrifice itself, he is the Passover lamb, and he is the one who's going to reconcile us to God. He's essentially the priest who makes that sacrifice. He's the sacrificer and the sacrificed. We don't play one of those roles. We're not the one making the sacrifice, and we're not the one being the sacrifice. Jesus is doing both. Again, our role is simply to trust in him, that what he's doing will be good for us, and that it is the way in which God is keeping his promises to us. So our job is not to make this work. Our job is to participate in it through trust and obedience. And so, of course, we now celebrate what Jesus and his disciples are doing, not as the Passover, but in what we call the Lord's Supper. And so this brings us back to our book and to the passages that we're looking at in this book. And let me just draw your attention to the passages that she uses in this book. Every gospel records the what we can now call the Last Supper, and so you can read each one of those. In this book, Levine draws our attention to the narrative in Luke. It's Luke 22:14 through 27. She also draws our attention to the one in John 13:1 through 16. And she also points out that, of course, Paul gives us a very brief narrative of this supper as well in 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 26. So if you want to pause this video again and just read through those passages real quickly, that would probably be good. And it will kind of help you see what were Jesus and the disciples doing? How is this related to the Passover? And how is it also genuinely Jesus doing something new, something that goes beyond the Passover? Now, of course, there are the passages on the Lord's Supper are so rich and so full of meaning. We can't possibly explore all those meanings in this one little video. But we do want to think about it. And so I encourage you to talk to someone, or maybe write some reflections in your journal about what you think about as you read through those passages. But I just want to draw out a few things in connection with the book that we're reading, and then let you think about the rest of it yourself. So we now celebrate this moment in time, Jesus celebrating the Passover with his disciples on the eve of his crucifixion. We call that the Last Supper, and we now celebrate it through the church ritual or liturgy that is called the Lord's Supper, sometimes called communion or the Eucharist. Different church traditions call it different things, but we're all talking about that covenant meal. And of course, as you know, different church traditions have different understandings of what this meal means theologically and biblically and ecclesially and all of those sorts of things. And I don't necessarily want to get into a debate about which is right and which is wrong, even though that's very interesting and certainly worth thinking about. But I do want to say that all the different church traditions agree that the Lord's Supper points us to Jesus. As far as I know, every tradition across the Christian spectrum agrees that the Lord's Supper points us to Jesus, that his broken body makes it possible for us to be healed, both body and soul, that his poured out blood establishes a new covenant with God so that we are brought back into right relationship, not only with God himself, but with others, with the people around us. That's one of the reasons why it's called communion, because it not only provides a new community between myself and God, it provides a new community between myself and everyone else who's entering into a new community with God. So we call it communion because it creates a new community. So the Lord's Supper is God's grace to his people who cannot live without him. And so it is something to be profoundly thankful for, to take both seriously, but also with great joy. I grew up in a tradition that tended to take the Lord's Supper very, very seriously, and often quoted Paul from 1 Corinthians 11, where he says, anyone who eats and drinks unworthily eats and drinks judgment on himself. And to be honest, I was always terrified growing up of taking the Lord's Supper because I thought, well, how can I possibly be worthy? So I'm eating and drinking judgment on myself every single time. And it wasn't until I was older, even in seminary, when I experienced the Anglican liturgy for the Lord's Supper, and found it to be a liturgy that really emphasized thankfulness and receiving from God that which we can't do for ourselves, which was really kind of a balm to my soul. And when my husband was working on his PhD program in Scotland, we went to the Episcopal Church of Scotland while we were there. And a line from their liturgy calls everyone forward for the Lord's Supper, and then says, happy are those who are called to the supper of the Lamb. And I really just love that line because it emphasizes who Jesus is and what Jesus is doing, and that is for our good, and that we can participate in that with great happiness. It doesn't make it not solemn, but it makes it it's not a fearful solemnity, it's a joyful solemnity, that Jesus is the one who makes us worthy when we can't make ourselves worthy. That's what he's doing. And the last thing that I want to talk about briefly is the Lord's Supper as pointing us towards servanthood. So, of course, Jesus's act to be our sacrifice, his willingness to go to the cross and give himself completely over to death for our sake, is the ultimate act of service. His willingness to put our needs, the needs of other people, above his own wants, desires, rights, or privileges. As Philippians 2 says, Jesus is the Son of God, but he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself a servant. Jesus doesn't have to die for us. He chooses to do so as an act of love and service. So he becomes a slave to us. And he embodies this at the Last Supper, as John writes down, by washing the disciples' feet. So, and he and Peter have kind of a funny conversation, not funny, but Peter misunderstands what's going on, and so Jesus has to explain it, but that Jesus is willing to act as Peter's slave. Slaves are people who wash other people's feet back in those days. Jesus is acting as a slave to his disciples. I'm not really a big fan of the phrase servant leadership, because honestly, I think we always end up ignoring the servant part and just talking about leadership, which is what we all love to do and be, right? Leaders. But Jesus doesn't use that phrase at all. That's not a biblical phrase. As far as I know, it's not anywhere in the Bible as a phrase, servant leaders. Jesus just talks about being a leader. And in fact, the word he uses is often translated as slave, not just servant. So he calls us to follow him in this. He gives up his life for us. He gives us up his dignity for us. He gives up all his rights for us. That's what it means to be a servant and a slave. And so I think the Lord's Supper is calling us to think about and pray about how we can give up ourselves for others, or at the same time, let others give up themselves for us. We're sometimes willing to do that for others, but feel awkward or embarrassed when we have to receive that kind of gift from someone else, just like Peter, who doesn't want Jesus to wash his feet because it seems so upside down and so wrong. And we're used to having all of our own resources and we can give those away, but needing from other people means I'm weak, I'm vulnerable, I don't have what I need. So sometimes we're not very good about receiving service from others, service we don't pay for and we don't ask for, but we desperately need. And so, of course, our current situation with the coronavirus offers us a unique setting in which to think about this. I think we always need to think about it, not just now, but we are in a unique setting now to think about what it means to be a servant to others and to let others be our servants. And so I'm wondering if maybe this week we all can pray about how to be a servant to others and let others be a servant to us. And I don't know what that means for you. I don't necessarily even know what it means for me. That's why we all need to pray about it. But, maybe if you're older, it means letting your adult children do your grocery shopping for you. Maybe it means spending some extra time, if you have extra time, writing notes of encouragement and sending it through the mail. My daughter's been doing that to her classmates, and it's amazing how thrilled they are to get those little notes. I don't know what it means for you, and I don't even know what it means for me, but I think maybe can think about the Lord's Supper as a call to think about that right now. And I want to be very clear, of course, that I am not encouraging anyone to go against the guidelines and rules laid out by the mayor and the governor. Minnehaha is under a shelter-in-place order. So I'm not saying go do something stupid to prove that you're a servant. But in this current situation, in this time and place, how can we follow Jesus being a servant or even a slave to others? How can we participate in Jesus's example, both by giving and receiving acts of service in this particular moment of time? So I'll leave you all there. I pray that each one of you is healthy and well, and will have a holy week that gives you time to think and pray about what it means to follow Jesus. I pray that for myself as well. And so I'll see you next time. Goodbye.